Good evening, everybody. Good evening. I'm not Julie Pace, but I promise she's coming. Those of you who had planned to come in November, thanks for sticking with us. I'm Mark Nykirk, the director of the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement here at NKU. And tonight's talk is part of our effort to elevate civic dialogue on campus and in the community. We have had a partnership with the Associated Press now for 15 years, bringing in a national journalist to talk to us. And so we're happy to be able to do that again, and especially happy tonight to have Julie Pace with us. Julie is the executive editor of the Associated Press. Normally would be coming from New York to be with us, but tonight coming through Washington, D.C., because it turns out that things happen there now and then that require her attention. But she has actually been with us once before. It was during COVID and a virtual-only presentation. And at the time, Julie was a lowly bureau chief in the nation's capital, but now she is the executive editor. And just to say a quick word about what that means, I think you really are hearing from one of the most significant journalists. AP is a resource for every news outlet that you can think of, really, and Julie is directing that coverage around the world on a daily basis, so we're very happy to have her back with us and back in this new role. I want to also welcome our virtual audience this evening, which I think is substantial, and if you are joining us virtually, you'll notice at the bottom of your screen that there is a Q&A function. Put your questions there, and when we get to the Q&A part of this night, we will look for your questions. Those of you with us in person, some of you have been here before for this, but we have a fun way for you to ask your question, the catch box. So it actually really does have a microphone in it, and you talk into the top of it, and when you're through with your question, you toss it to the next person who has a question. Just raise your hand to ask a question. So we can have a little fun with that, and we can see who is the best at tossing things. Please do not use the familiar line, "I don't need a mic, everyone can hear me." We have a virtual audience, so we do need you on the microphone. I say as I drop mine, sorry about that. We have a brief introduction, but just to tell you that Julie has been with us earlier in the day, met with journalism students, some of who are back here this evening, and it really was just a question and answer session for a little over an hour. And Dean Kirby, you can be rest assured that the students ask great questions. So the education part is going well. In fact, one student said if this was a year ago, I wouldn't have had the courage to ask a question, but now I do, and she asked several, so it's a good session there. After college, Julie started out as with dreams of being a foreign correspondent, and was a freelancer in South America, I think.
Southern Africa.
South Africa, I'm sorry, yes. And didn't get rich doing that, but eventually ended up at the Associated Press and covered the White House during the Obama years and somewhat during the Trump years before becoming Washington bureau chief, and then moving on, I guess a little over a year ago to 2 years. Time flies. To New York to be executive editor. So she'll have some remarks, and then we'll have time for questions. So please help me welcome Julie Pace.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening. I want to thank the team at Northern Kentucky University for having me tonight and really for hosting these conversations, which I think are so important, particularly when we're at this moment of such polarization in our country and at a time when I also know that trust in the media can be very low. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you here in person and also our virtual audience today about the work that we do at the Associated Press and how we are working hard to rise to the challenges that are facing our industry in the 21st century, and there are many. Now, this has been a particularly challenging time for us at the AP as we balance coverage of two wars, wars in the Middle East and in Europe, as well as a looming US presidential election. And it's really not an exaggeration when I say this. We are the only news organization in the world covering all three of those stories at the scale that we are. We have journalists on the ground in all 50 states in the US, as well as permanent bureaus in Ukraine, in Russia, in Israel, and in Gaza. There is no other news organization covering all three of those stories in the way that we do. Now, for me, that often means that my schedule is in flux and ever-changing. For example, as Mark mentioned, I was supposed to be here a few weeks ago and had to reschedule. I'm really appreciative of the university for being so flexible and for all of you with being flexible on your time. I should also note that when I get a chance to come out and speak anywhere outside of New York, it's always a great chance to see some of my AP colleagues, and I just want to give a shout out to the AP current crew and alumni crew who's here today, so thank you very much for being with us. So we have a little bit of an agenda. I'm going to talk for a bit about some of the challenges that we face in the media industry, but particularly at the AP. But I really want to save time for your questions and happy to talk about anything that's on your minds. I should also note that you may not agree with everything that I have to say tonight, and that's okay. But I do hope that by the end of our conversation, you appreciate just how seriously we take our role at the AP in being a fact-based, independent news organization, and just how important it is to us to reach audiences across the United States, whatever their political leanings, and audiences around the world. That is at the heart of what we do. It's been the heart of our mission for 177 years, and that hasn't changed. Now, the ways we deliver the news certainly have changed. We started out literally delivering the news via the Pony Express, and you don't see many teletypes around our newsrooms anymore. But that mission of delivering fact-based, independent news, it hasn't changed. So I want to start out by taking a minute to just linger on our mission statement at the AP, because I love it, and it's great to see it on this big screen. It's even more powerful. Let me just read this off for a moment. We believe accurate news is essential to civil society. It starts with firsthand reporting, and the wider its reach, the greater its impact. More than half the planet sees news from us every single day, and we believe a world in which more people know what's happening around them is better equipped to face the challenges we share. No organization in the world does more to advance the power of facts. I believe really deeply in that mission, and again, I hope by the end of our talk tonight you will understand how central it is to everything that we do. Now, there have been challenges to the AP throughout our history, but I think it's fair to say that the scope of the challenges we face today can seem particularly daunting. The ways in which technology has created platforms for misinformation to flourish and travel around the world at lightning speed, the way politicians and powerful interests can demonize the media and try to discredit our reporting, the ways so many people across the country and around the world have chosen to tune out the news or information that doesn't validate what they already believe, and the ways algorithms online contribute to creating an echo chamber that can become incredibly difficult to break through, including for some sophisticated news customers. And of course, we need to be honest that we in the media haven't always lived up to our own standards for transparency and credibility. Sometimes we make ourselves the story in a way that can undermine our public service mission. Oh, and then there's AI. You may have heard of that recently. It's really looming over us right now, threatening to fuel more disinformation and further disrupt the media industry's already tricky business models. So it's enough to make you wonder, why would anybody want to make a career in this business? And I certainly got some questions about that from some of the students earlier today. And I'd be lying if it doesn't sometimes feel like those of us who are trying to carry out this mission aren't pushing a big rock up a hill only to keep getting it sliding back on us. But I do believe that our mission is important enough to keep trying. In fact, I think it's essential. So I want to spend some time tonight talking about some of the ways that we are rising to these challenges that are facing our industry right now and the challenges to our audiences. Before I do that, though, I want to tell you a little bit more about who we are at the AP, because I think that sometimes people don't exactly know what this news organization is. As I mentioned, the AP was founded 177 years ago. We were founded as a news cooperative to help a small group of newspapers share information and coverage of the Mexican-American War. So that coverage sharing agreement went pretty well, and they decided to keep it up. They kept a cooperative together, and they expanded it. Over the years, coverage expanded across the US and then internationally. We added photos, we added audio and video to our coverage offerings. Today, the AP has journalists in 250 locations in 100 countries around the world. The core of our business is really providing journalism to other news organizations, thousands of them, in fact, around the world. That means there's a really good chance that every day when you're reading your local newspaper or website, watching local or cable news, you're seeing journalism produced by the AP, sometimes without even knowing it. This means that the people that we are engaging with, the people who are consuming our journalism, are young and old. They live in the United States, and they're Republicans and Democrats and independents. They also live outside of the United States. So that means that we at the AP every single day have to produce a news report that can be deemed credible and trustworthy by that wide swath of people. They need to trust it, they need to believe it's fair, they need to believe it's unbiased. That's not easy. And we don't always get it right, but it's a North Star, as I said, that we take really seriously. Now, there are few coverage areas where adhering to that North Star, to those principles, are more important than in US politics, particularly as we see partisanship in this country reach new heights or depths with each election. So that's the first challenge that we're going to talk about here today. How do we maintain our nonpartisan position at the AP in such a highly polarized environment? The first thing that I would say here is that doing that, maintaining that nonpartisan position, it's simply a non-negotiable for the AP. Other news organizations make other decisions, and they're comfortable taking more partisan positions. In some cases, that can be quite good for business, both on the right and on the left. But the AP simply cannot be a news organization that is seen as leaning toward a particular political persuasion. That's in large part because of what I just mentioned, the fact that our business model actually requires us to deliver a news report that can be deemed credible in every part of the country. But when it comes to elections, the need to be viewed above the partisan fray goes far beyond that, and it gets to the heart of AP's particularly unique role in the American democracy. For most of our history, more than 170 years, not quite 177, but more than 170, the AP has counted the vote in elections across the country and declared winners of races, from the presidency down to mayors and state legislatures. You may have noticed, for example, the AP name attached to race calls in the recent Kentucky governor's race, or Ohio ballot measures, or the Virginia legislature. I'm often asked, why does the AP do this? Why did you start doing this? And the answer is actually pretty simple. No one else was doing it. And no one else still is doing it at the level that we are. In the United States, because of the way elections are administered, there's no single point of truth for races and results. They're administered at state and county levels, not at the federal level. So the AP stepped into that void to tally votes around the country and report on winners. In a general election, we will actually declare winners in more than 3,000 races across the country. We often call this the single largest act of journalism in the world, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. We spin up a network of about 5,000 election stringers who work with us to collect vote tallies from county clerks around this country. Sometimes that's in very sophisticated ways. Sometimes it's literally walking into a county clerk's office, getting handed a piece of paper, and entering it into our systems. We have teams of experienced election analysts and race callers who examine the vote count, as well as historical data and our own survey of the American electorate to determine the winners. Now, I'm shorthanding here a bit because this is an incredibly rigorous process and frankly one that surpasses my knowledge of statistical analysis. But I can say that our success rate in the last election was 99.9% accuracy. Though, as I always like to note, our standard is perfection. It used to be that the AP could declare winners in an election and assume that people would accept those results because of the rigor and the scrutiny that we put around our process and because of that reputation we have for accuracy and nonpartisanship. But we know now that election results will be challenged, sometimes by very powerful forces who will try to cast our race calls as partisan acts, as opposed to decisions guided by math, and guided by facts. So we know now that we have to do more to show our work. You're really going to see us in this election do exactly that. We are going to be showing in real time why we are confident calling a race, and we're going to show how we did it. We experimented with some of that in these past elections. So last month, shortly after declaring that Andy Beshear was the winner of the governor's race here, we were out with the story explaining how he won by carrying the most populous counties in the state, the majority of the swing counties, and by narrowing the margin in some of the Republican-leaning counties that he lost. This is a model showing that work that we're going to replicate in every major race we call in 2024. Importantly, we're also going to be transparent about why we're not ready to call a race, because we find that it's sometimes in the absence of a race call that misinformation or conspiracies can flourish. Now, in most cases, there's actually quite a simple reason why we haven't called a race yet. Maybe the vote is just too close to call in some key county, or a judge has ordered polls to stay open later because of long lines. Or the race is so close that there's a possibility of a runoff, and we don't want to insert ourselves in that process. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that taking these steps guarantees that there won't be still some people out there who won't challenge our race calls, but our job is to provide as clear a picture as possible of what's going on behind all of those numbers. The other key in building trust in our race calls is making sure that everything we're doing now to cover this election is being done in a nonpartisan and fact-based way. What that doesn't mean is that every story we do gives equal weight to all sides. It means that when we see facts and they're being misconstrued, that we don't pull punches. For example, in every story that we do where Donald Trump challenges the results of the 2020 election result, we make clear that was a free and fair election without widespread interference. We make clear that Republicans also believe that. That's a fact. That's not a partisan position. That's a fact. But to me, being able to cover an election in a nonpartisan way means that when you step back and you look at the totality of our coverage over the course of a week, for example, it should look like we are genuinely trying to reflect a range of perspectives. We have to show that we're talking to Trump supporters and Biden supporters and anybody in between, that we're reflecting what's motivating them, what's worrying them, that we're trying to talk to voters in urban areas and rural communities, that we're not using snarky headlines or adjectives to describe one party and not the other. I'm really proud of the time and effort that we put into creating that type of balance. We don't always get it right, as I said, but that goal, that objective, is at the center of everything that we do. I should also note that this is the same approach that we take at the AP to any highly polarized story. We've been having very similar discussions, in fact, about how to tackle coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. We're really fortunate to have a deeply experienced team leading this coverage out of the Middle East, and as I mentioned, full-time permanent staff in both Israel and in Gaza. This may be the only story in the world where every word we write, every image we file is picked apart and scrutinized for signs of bias more than US political coverage. But as I said, we take a very similar approach. Our goal is to ensure that we're not being seen as taking a side. Our job is to inform. Our job is to show the realities of what's happening on the ground, including in Gaza, a place where most people around the world will never visit, will never see with their own eyes. It means making sure that we're reporting on both the mounting civilian deaths and humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and continuing to report on the collective trauma in Israel after the October attacks and the hostages who are still missing there. This is, again, where being there, on the ground reporting, having local knowledge is so invaluable. Our teams in Israel and Gaza aren't just on the ground covering these stories, they're living through it. And I would be remiss if I didn't take this moment to mention how incredibly proud I am of the work that they're doing, the sacrifices that they and their families are making to help keep the world informed of what's going on. Now, there's a direct link between maintaining our nonpartisan and independent approach, both in the US and globally, and the second challenge that I want to address here. How do we at the AP focus on the facts in the face of rising misinformation And how do we try to break through that noise? I wish I had some simpler challenges I could talk to you all about. Misinformation and disinformation, this has always existed in some form. But there are a variety of factors that have converged right now to make the type of misinformation that we see particularly potent and a particular challenge for news organizations like the AP. The first is technology, and that is before I even get into AI, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But technology has really allowed for misinformation to travel unchecked, far and wide. And that's only increased in recent months, as we've seen some of the more powerful social media platforms, I'm talking about X, formerly Twitter, do away with any real verification system. Put quite simply, there are just fewer ways for us to be able to determine whether a viral post is real or not, and there are similar challenges on other platforms. Powerful algorithms, and some of the students asked about this today, mean that once somebody has started to engage with misinformation online, they're more likely to get fed it. Suddenly, the misinformation that they're seeing goes from being that outlier or the minority of what they see to something that becomes all-consuming. We've also seen the ways in which the impact of living in that type of misinformation bubble has evolved. You know, it used to be there was that aunt of yours who would send you that conspiracy theory email or talk about that thing she saw on Facebook when you got together over Thanksgiving. Now we're seeing that people are acting off of misinformation, often in scary and violent ways. That's become particularly evident during some of the criminal trials that we've seen for people charged in the January 6th insurrection on the US Capitol. Over and over again, we've heard defendants talk about the ways in which they had become consumed by misinformation about what happened in the US election, the ways in which that information was repeatedly put in front of them online. But of course, in that instance and in many others, it's not just the technology that's to blame for the spread of misinformation. Increasingly, we see powerful people who are amplifying it. And that's not just in the United States. For example, when a team of AP journalists witnessed horrific atrocities in Mariupol, Ukraine at the beginning of the war there, including the bombing of a maternity ward, which you've probably seen photos of, prominent Russian officials quickly rushed out to declare that the incident was staged and that the bloodied women whose images were spread around the world were actors. I can verify that that is not true. We have also seen politicians in the United States, including former President Donald Trump, continue to insist that the 2020 election was fraudulent, despite there being no evidence to support that statement. Again, when I say that, that is not a partisan position, that is a fact-based position. Increasingly, it can feel like there are no real consequences for people who are peddling in misinformation. There are, of course, some exceptions to that. The $1.5 billion settlement awarded to families of the victims of the Sandy Hook school shooting after Alex Jones spread false conspiracy theories, or some of the criminal charges that we have seen related to efforts to undermine the election. But none of that has forced a broad reversal of the trends we're seeing when it comes to the spread of misinformation. So how do we tackle that reality at the AP? I'll be honest, it isn't easy. And in fact, it can become quite dispiriting for some of our staff who spend so much time trying to ensure that they're getting the facts right, that they're verifying the information that they're publishing, that they're showing their work, citing reputable sources, only to see those efforts denigrated or outright dismissed. And again, I will repeat this many times here. The reason we take this so seriously has nothing to do with backing a particular political party, advocating for a particular position. As I hope you saw from my earlier remarks, maintaining our nonpartisan position is essential to who we are. But we do side with the facts. That's a really important distinction I always want to call out. We're not in opposition to any individual, leader, or group. We are in support of the facts. So we have a few strategies for trying to ensure that we're getting those facts in front of as many people as possible. First, repetition. You can hear what I'm repeating throughout these remarks. We do the same thing in our journalism. When misinformation becomes more powerful, it's often because it's repeated, it's retweeted, it's reposted. So we have to make sure that we're doing the same with the facts. That means that even now, 3 years after the 2020 presidential election, we still show our work in every story, making clear the range of courts and government officials who certified the election results. Second, we don't repeat misinformation for the sake of balance. If a particular group or party is regularly disseminating a piece of misinformation, we are under no obligation to repeat it. An example, we don't include the voices of climate change deniers in our coverage of the warming planet. No, that's not because we're advocating for anything in particular. It's because the facts and the data show objectively that the climate is changing. And there's no reason to provide a dissenting view if there aren't facts or data to support it. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a range of views on what should be done, if anything, to tackle climate change, and how aggressive or light touch governments or businesses should be. That's a relevant debate, and that's one where we do strive to show all perspectives. But the facts on the underlying question are clear and established. Third, we try to reach people where they are. In this regard, AP actually has some advantages because our journalism is used in so many local news organizations around the country. It gives us this special responsibility, I believe, as well when it comes to fact-checking and verifying information. If you go back to where I started talking about those misinformation bubbles that people can be consumed with online, those same people may still go to their local newspaper, their local website, turn on their local newscast, check out the weather or the sports scores or see what their mayor did that day. And while they're there, they may pass by some AP content. They may not know it's ours, but they may run across it. Maybe they'll even read it or watch it. Again, I am not naive to believe that doing that once or twice will get them to change their minds. But it means we at the AP have a fighting chance of getting fact-based information in front of people. And I do think that's a special responsibility. This is also why you will see AP on a range of social media platforms, doing fact checks and verification in multiple mediums. That includes doing video explainers and fact checks on YouTube and Instagram. And yes, we are on TikTok. If there are people there and there's misinformation there, we want to make sure that we're there too, inserting that fact-based reporting into the conversation. The third challenge that I want to talk about, AI. The uncertainty posed by it. How do we harness the promise, and how do we mitigate for the peril? Now, I'll be honest, if we were having this conversation a year ago, AI would probably not have been on here as one of the top challenges facing the news industry. It simply was not a significant part of the conversation. But it really underscores just how fast the landscape around us is changing. Because I can tell you that this is probably the topic that I get asked the most about, externally and also within our newsroom. And you'll notice that I've introduced this topic by talking about both the promise and the peril, because I really do believe that it's both. And it's important that we're looking at this from a news industry standpoint on both tracks. Certainly, I know the anxiety that exists among journalists, like people in many other industries, who fear that the use of AI will lead to job cuts. And after years of news organizations trying to optimize their online content to reach audiences through search engines, we're all closely monitoring the ways that AI could impact search and traffic to our websites. We also believe strongly at AP that news organizations' intellectual property must be protected as generative AI technology advances, and there needs to be appropriate legal framework to ensure that our work is not consumed into AI models without our permission. But as a 177-year-old company, we also know at the AP that you have to be willing to embrace new technology. And we have a decade's worth of experience already at AP in using AI in our newsroom with no job losses. I'll repeat that again because I think sometimes people are surprised to hear that. We've been using AI at the AP for a decade. We actually think that that has given us several use cases of how we can use AI to handle more rote tasks and free up journalists to do higher value work. For example, we've used AI to automate earnings reports and stock tables. We use it to automate sports scores. We didn't eliminate jobs when we introduced those new technologies. Instead, the reporters and editors who had been handling those tasks moved into roles where there was more emphasis on creating original content, doing source reporting, analysis, the kinds of things that we truly believe only human journalists can do. I'll also note that anything we have ever produced for the public that is generated by AI is labeled as such. We believe we need to be transparent when we're using AI to create content. And I think that labeling and transparency will become even more vital if we start incorporating generative AI cases into our news report and news product. In fact, much of the conversation that we're having around AI right now focuses on standards and transparency. How will this technology fit into our values as opposed to the other way around? This summer, after months of discussion across the AP and the wider industry, we unveiled a set of standards for the use of generative AI, and we made these publicly available at ap.org. The reception from across the media industry has been really positive. So I want to walk you through a few of the key aspects of our standards to give you a sense of how we're thinking about what I think could be a really transformational moment, certainly within the media industry, but beyond. The first standard is the most important. We've set a standard that says that AP does not see AI as a replacement for journalists in any way. We want AI to help assist journalists when it makes sense, but ultimately we believe that AP journalists must be the final arbiter of the facts, and we must be the ones held accountable for the information we provide the public. We've also stated clearly in our standards at this point that we are not allowing the use of generative AI. That's the more advanced AI that you've seen really stir the conversation over the last several months. Right now, that is a hard line for us, though I'll talk about how that could change in the coming months or years. Even as we're restricting our ability at the moment to use content created by Gen AI, there's obviously a lot of Gen AI material out there in the world. So our guidance to journalists is that any output from a generative AI tool should be treated as unvetted source material. We have to apply our same editorial standards and judgment when we're considering whether to use that information for publication. We also refrain from transmitting any AI-generated images that are suspected or proven to be false depictions of reality. We don't allow generative AI to alter any of our photos, our video, or audio. Now, you may be saying, well, that's all well and good, but what about when you don't know for sure if something is being generated by AI? That's the tricky part, and that's the part that's only going to get harder as this technology improves. Our best guidance to our staff is to employ their regular news judgment. Ask key questions like, where did this information come from? Can I corroborate it anywhere else? How can I attribute the source of this information? Those basic questions, those of you who have worked in the media industry, those basic questions can actually become quite revelatory. We do expect that our standards will evolve as this technology does. So our standards team is meeting monthly to review this guidance. And as we update it for internal use, we're also going to make sure that we're sharing it publicly as part of regular industry-wide style and standards guidance. Now, even as we proceed with caution, and we are proceeding cautiously from a standard standpoint, we do see a lot of reason to be excited about the possibility of generative AI. The main areas of focus for us when it comes to exploring this new technology is how can we create an improved, more efficient, and productive experience for our customers, news organizations, and for our audiences and their audiences? How do we make our content easier to find? How do we get breaking news into people's hands in more efficient ways? How do we let people know about our plans for covering those breaking stories? Are there ways that we can offer summaries of what's available via the AP, given the vast amount of content that we are producing each day? Right now, we have journalists in the newsroom who spend hours, for example, collecting and summarizing that information. It's called digests, and they send this out to our subscribers around the world. If we could set those journalists loose to do more original reporting, or if they could be doing deeper analysis, or if they could be working with our customers, particularly in local news outlets, to try to identify the gaps that they have in their coverage that we could fill, we believe that this could be a real win-win. Our goal is to create a culture of experimentation within the AP to help us quickly identify some good, solid use cases for AI. So we've created this sandbox environment, which is quite fun at a 177-year-old news organization. This sandbox environment and training opportunities for our developers and our data scientists to learn about the capabilities that exist. We also are working with some of the key leading strategic partners in the industry. They have a framework to evaluate and prioritize ideas and use cases. And again, we start with a series of questions. Does this use case align with our standards and values? Is generative AI even the right application in this use case? Or could it be better served by something simpler? Does it align with our overall organizational priorities? Does it make financial sense? Does it push us toward our broader goals? If a possible use case fits that criteria, then we start moving it through a series of gates to allow for innovation focused on quality. At each step, we use metrics to determine when to move forward and when to move on. We run small pilots to prove whether a solution meets our editorial and our revenue goals, and we make sure that we're monitoring for quality, that we're tuning the solutions, and growing the capabilities. Throughout this work, quality, accuracy, AP standards remain our top priority. We have to make sure that we're not making decisions based just on what technology can do, because we all know with AI and so much else, the technology will always be able to do quite a bit. We have to make sure that any use cases make sense for us as a news organization, as a trusted, independent source of fact-based information. Nothing we embark on in this space can take away from that. And I walk you through that in detail because I want to leave you with this point. This is an exciting space. It's one that we want to make sure that we are on the leading edge of, but nothing we would ever do with AI would take away from our role as a fact-based, independent news organization. So those are three pretty big challenges that we face. And you may be sitting there after all of that saying, wow, this is a pretty grim time to be in the news business. And as I said at the top, it's certainly not an easy time. But I truly cannot think of a moment when our work and our mission at the AP has been more important. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I'm really looking forward to taking your questions. Oh, the box.
The box. So if you have a question, raise your hand and the box is coming to you. All right, you guys think about your questions. We'll have one in just a minute. Julie, if I could ask,
Please.
When you were unable to come here in November, one of the things that you talked about tonight, trust of the media, and the changing environment of social media is what detained you in D.C. And I'll let you talk about the specifics, but some of you may know the story in a general sense, which was an accusation that on social media, I think, that some news outlets had used photographs from a freelance photographer who was aware of the invasion of Israel prior to its occurrence. And so that needed to be analyzed and responded.
It did need to be analyzed and responded to because it was a very serious accusation against the AP and a series of other international news organizations. The thing I would say at the top is that the Associated Press and no one that we worked with had any advanced knowledge of the attack in Israel. In fact, what our freelance photographers and others did was they did journalism. Found out something was happening. Gaza is a small place. I was there last summer visiting our team there. It's a small place. In the early morning of October 7th, there were rockets overhead. Journalists got phone calls. They rushed to the place that they always rush when there is fighting between Israel and Hamas, and they saw an attack unfolding. They took pictures. They did reporting. They delivered facts. That's what we do. Now, when there are accusations leveled at us that something more nefarious may have happened, we respond by saying, we need to look into this. We need to take this seriously. We need to make sure that nothing has happened here that could undermine that trust that we ask people to put in us. And so for about 48 hours, I had a team of about 20 people at the AP focused on trying to answer exactly this question, interviewing everybody on our staff who was involved in that initial coverage, getting together all of the metadata on all of the photos that we moved. We took that extremely seriously. We launched essentially an internal investigation into that. Fortunately, but no surprise, we found nothing nefarious in anything that we found. As we were concluding our internal review, the people who were at the start of that effort, who first put those accusations out online, said, we're not a news organization, we didn't have any evidence, we were just asking questions, and we're perfectly happy with what the AP and others have said. It's just an example of how fast misinformation can spread, how seriously we take those accusations, even when we know at our core that they're not right, how much we need to put in the work to prove that we're right. But I can tell you that even having done that, we still are getting questions about that. But again, I'm extremely confident, based on all of the work that our team put in to verify what happened on that day, that we had no advanced knowledge and that our reporting continues to be independent.
Thank you. And I think we have a question in the audience.
Yeah, I've come to realize how important history is and understanding it, as far as where we've been, where we are today, and where we're going in that sort of context. And it's curious to me as to what the history is. It's
Speak into the box.
I didn't know it was a microphone. That should be a disclosure item on this thing, that it's a microphone. Has this, nonpartisanship, I would guess when folks like Rich went to journalism school, they didn't have a class in there. But what is the historical context of this objective reporting? Has that always existed, or did we just grow up in this post-World War II time where, we naively think, well, that's how it's always been and that's how it will be?
It's a great question, and actually, coming into this role that I have now, I spent a lot of time learning more about the history of the AP. This is an incredibly storied organization, and as our alumni in the room can tell you, people really take the history of it quite seriously. And I think one of the things that's amazing about who we are as an organization is that this notion of being nonpartisan has been at our core from the start. Now, as I said, it's partially driven by who we are as a business. When your business is dependent on being able to deliver one news report to every corner of this country, and really now to every part of the world, you have to think about, am I presenting this news in a way that's creating a barrier for entry for people of different political leanings, for people who may consume this with different perspectives. It doesn't mean that we do it in a way that requires people to agree with it. I don't expect that people agree with it. But do we create that barrier for entry? That's one of the things I think about a lot. Again, snarky headlines, using adjectives in one place but not in another. I don't expect that you agree with it, but I expect you think I'm giving you a fair shake. I expect that you can look at our news report and see multiple perspectives reflected, that you shouldn't look at the AP news report and say, gosh, they really only seem to be speaking to Democrats, or gosh, they really only seem to care about Republicans today, right? You have to be able to see a range of perspectives. There are, throughout the history of journalism, there are other news organizations that similarly believe in that nonpartisan approach. I again think we're unique because of the business model that we have that requires us to spread that same single news report to so many places in so many different ways. It's a challenge, but it's one that we've really embraced. And I think, I sometimes wish, even though I would never put a camera in any of our news meetings, I sometimes wish I could, because I think the way that it infuses so many of our discussions is really powerful and really admirable. And I actually think people would feel really good if they saw the way that people took that so seriously every day.
Thank you for taking my question. Last week, NPR reported that there were 50 casualties in Gaza for journalists. And I believe this week there's a report that there are over 60. My question is a two-part question. One, how many of the casualties of journalists in Gaza are AP journalists? And then the second part of my question is, why is it that this conflict has caused so many deaths to journalists when NPR says that this is the deadliest in 30 years.
It is the deadliest, and fortunately, all of our AP journalists are physically safe right now. I can tell you that this is certainly in my relatively short time in this job, this is the biggest staff safety challenge that we have faced, and I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I think Gaza is in the best of circumstances, Gaza is a very difficult place to operate in. It's extremely restricted. Movement in and out of the territory is extremely limited. In this situation, if you were in Gaza when the attacks happened, the territory was locked down even further. So for our journalists on the ground, there was no ability to leave. If they had wanted to leave, they had no way out. Subsequently, we saw that the Israeli military ordered evacuations or warned that people should evacuate from northern Gaza to southern Gaza. This is a tiny territory. This is a small area with about 2 million people. So you've essentially crammed the whole population into half of the size of the territory. The humanitarian commissions are quite dire right now. People are living in crowded areas. Even that southern part of Gaza is under pretty relentless attack. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that there really isn't a safe space there, and that's why you've seen journalists really, I don't think there's anything about those journalists that made them particular targets. They're just part of this population that's dealing with this just extreme circumstance. The other thing I just want to note here is that for the AP and for some of the very small number of news organizations that are also operating there, international news organizations, our journalists there are all Palestinian. So this choice on whether to leave, even if they could leave, is quite difficult. It's not like some of us maybe deciding during the pandemic that we're gonna go to a country house or, go upstate or go, work somewhere remotely for a little while. Many of our staff have never left Gaza. So this idea of leaving, even if they could, even if they get on some of these small evacuation lists, it's an incredibly difficult situation. They're taking care of their families. The considerations are quite immense. But I would just summarize, I think, again, by saying that there's no special protections for journalists there right now, and as a result, what we're seeing with the attacks and with the humanitarian crisis is affecting them just like it is, everybody else in the population. I also want to note just quickly, because I do, in the spirit of the overall approach that I took here, I did just want to speak for a moment about my colleagues in Israel as well. We have an incredible team there too, and what they have gone through is also quite a significant trauma. It's very different, right? They are not dealing with physical safety risks at the moment, and they're certainly not dealing with the humanitarian crisis, but they have gone through a significant trauma. It's a small country. Everybody there knows somebody, who was killed or taken hostage. We had a former AP staffer who was killed in the October 7th attacks. They're also deeply concerned about their family and their futures. And so you have two teams in very different circumstances right now who are trying to cover this story while they're living through it. And again, I would just echo what I said earlier, that I couldn't be more proud of the work that they're doing.
Julie, I have another question in the room I see, but let me give you one from the virtual audience. And it's first part of this is a comment, and the second part is a question. So really like your commitment to the concept of new transparency with regard to explaining AP's customers and its audience its decision on election calls when the winners are declared, and explanations for failure to call a winner in the late stages. So that's the comment. Thank you. Question, will efforts to vet artificial intelligence source presentations require a cadre of AP specialists around the world attached to the major editing nerve centers?
Is that related to vetting material created by AI?
I think, yeah, it's the general question about the challenge of AI, so a little bit separate from the predictions of elections.
It's a great question. Yes, this is a global team effort. And to be honest, we are having to build some skill and capacity in-house right now. The good thing is that so much of what it's going to entail in order to really be able to identify what's generated by AI and what's not, as I mentioned, comes down to the basics of reporting that we're quite good at. That's the foundation. So in that respect, I'm confident. We also, for the last several years, have had teams of people who are trained in UGC, user-generated content, things that exist in the world that citizen journalists might be taking, or just real people out there trying to make sure that we can match the geolocation of a photo or a piece of video to where the person says it's from, trying to match up what that image shows versus what we can see from other Google images. Is that tree in the right place? Trying to determine what's real and what's not. Those same skills that we have employed for verifying UGC are coming to bear for AI-generated technology. At the same time, this technology is getting quite advanced already. Right now you can kind of spot some things that are going on, but it's becoming quite advanced. Part of what we need to do is make sure that we are improving our own skills and staying up with the technology. The other piece of this, though, to be honest, is we also need cooperation from AI companies. We need cooperation from tech companies to do things. There's a whole conversation happening around watermarks, whether there should be some kind of watermark on anything that is generated using AI technology. That's not something we're able to control, but we want to be part of that conversation to say, hey, these are the things that will happen if we allow some of this imagery to go forward really without any kind of marking on it. But that's not something, unfortunately, that we're going to be able to control on our own.
I do have a question that builds upon the previous one about journalists in Gaza and Israel, but it's about journalists and safety in the world in general. So we have the police raid on the Marion County record earlier this year, and Evan Gershkovich has been imprisoned in Russia for over a year. And there are also a lot of, probably an increasing number of governments and countries in the world where they are more willing to crack down on the press and are more willing to imprison journalists. And there's also now there are also tech companies and social media platforms that are also restricting the accounts of newspapers and news organizations. So how does AP, what kind of measures does AP take to protect journalists, but also at the same time allow them to report on what is happening?
It's a great question, and you summarized the threats and the challenges really well there. They're so multifaceted. They are physical threats, they are online threats, they're happening in the United States, they're happening internationally, they are happening by individuals, and they're happening by governments and organized interests. I think we probably face more threats right now to our journalists than at any time in our history. So what are we doing about that? The first thing we did actually just a few months ago is we brought in a new head of global safety and security at AP. That's a position that reports to me. So I think that kind of sums up a lot of this, which is the head of safety and security at the AP reports to the head of news. That's where our biggest threats lie. He, in the last couple of months, has been in Ukraine and been in the Middle East, but has also been in the United States, talking to our teams who are going to be on the front lines of the elections, also who are most likely to be dealing with just unrest, protests, things that can escalate and get out of hand really quickly. The other thing that we have really focused on over the last couple of years is online safety and security. And this is both how journalists can protect themselves, when they are just dealing with sources online, but really importantly when it comes to online threats. And this has been particularly a problem for women and for journalists of color who face just really intense backlashes for very straightforward reporting. So we've built a program in-house. It's called the SAFE program, and it's used quite widely, and it really helps. What we really are able to do is when a journalist is facing significant online harassment, we can sort of surround them with a support network. And that can be things like dealing with the tech companies to try to get their accounts locked down. Sometimes it's as simple as we will assign somebody to monitor their accounts and the comments that they're receiving. Sometimes the journalist wants to keep their account up they just don't want to see everything that's happening there. So we will actually assign someone to monitor it for them. We also know that sometimes those online threats can become physical threats, and so we stay in close touch with law enforcement throughout that process. The last thing I would just mention is something that you referenced, which is the ways in which journalists are under threat from authoritarian governments and restrictive governments. We operate at the AP in some really tricky places. We operate in some really tricky places. And it's something that, me and my team spend a lot of time working on. How do we make sure in these places that we are doing our jobs, that we are operating in a free, fair, and independent way, knowing that doing so could put our journalists at risk. We've had to deal with that in Russia, we deal with that in China, we deal with that in Myanmar, we deal with that in just this range of countries. And I think that the threats to journalists, unfortunately, from governments are only going to increase. We have an excellent legal team, I can say, that's really steeped in this as well. This is one of those areas where I think, unfortunately, I feel a lot more pessimistic about the future than optimistic, but I'm really confident in the steps that we put into place to try to make sure that this is a daily part of our conversation.
Julie, there's a virtual question that is a bit of a follow-up, and you may have already answered it, but the way it's phrased may prompt some additional insights. And specifically, what does the AP do to prepare its journalists to work in a war zone, including training and equipment?
That's a great question. So there's a range of trainings that we put in place and a range of things that we look for before we assign a journalist to a conflict zone. The first thing I would say is that we do benefit from having a pretty deep bench of experienced journalists. So at the start of a conflict, that's who we tend to rely on. The people who can go into these situations, who have done it before, who've gone through trainings, hazardous environment trainings, who kind of really understand the rules of the road. We liaise with our security team. We also work really closely with other news organizations. I'm on a WhatsApp group with my counterparts from some of the other large news organizations, and when it comes to staff safety, that's a place where we don't compete. We really collaborate. So we lean first on that bench of deeply experienced journalists, but then we also look for opportunities within these conflicts to train up that next generation, to really deepen that bench, because unfortunately, these are the types of situations that we know we're going to be dealing with for quite a long time. So we look for people who may express interest in wanting to do this type of coverage. We organize trainings for them ahead of time. We partner them up on the ground in these locations with their more experienced colleagues, try to make sure that we've got that ability to rotate people in, because one of the things that I think is very clear, and this is particularly true now when we're dealing with two very active wars, is that people need time. They need time physically, and they need time mentally to step away. And one of the things I would say is that physical training is a really important component of what we do, but we have really tried to prioritize over the last couple of years providing mental health services to our journalists who are in the field, making sure that that is an active and open part of our conversation, that it's not something that anybody should be ashamed of. We really talk about it quite openly. The other thing I just want to note here, because I think it's part of this conversation that we don't often talk about, is the stress and trauma and the drain on journalists who are dealing with some of these difficult situations remotely. So when you go into a hazardous environment, you probably have had training. You've probably thought about the risk. You probably kind of know something or can have some sense of what level of risk you're putting yourself in and what you're going to see. We have a whole other group of journalists who are sitting in production hubs in New York and London and Bangkok and all around the world who get inundated with just horrible imagery, kind of just horrible imagery. And we've really taken some steps to prioritize, what they're dealing with and the particular stress and trauma that comes from dealing with that imagery remotely. I've spent a lot of time talking to, mental health experts about that in particular, and that's something that any AP journalist could come into contact with, not somebody who just signs up to go to a war zone.
We're going to go to a question in the audience.
Well, I feel very shy following questions about the safety and mental health of journalists with a shallow AI question.
I'll take it.
So forgive me. So this is sort of the flip side of the earlier AI question, which is about AP scrutinizing content generated by AI. What about the flip side, where you have AP-generated content that might be consumed by AI as part of large language models? You referred to it obliquely, and maybe I can phrase it this way. Would you not want, since AP wants millions of humans to consume its content in order to create their values of a fact-based world, would you not want inhuman intelligences as well to consume your content, to form their view of the world aligned with our values?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and actually the short answer is yes, we actually do want that, but there's an important kind of caveat to that. Right now, most of these large language models, these large chatbots, are already consuming our information, right? I mean, it's available on the internet, and they are consuming it. We think it's really important that as they do that, that our IP is protected. It costs a lot of money to do what we do. Journalism is not cheap. We spend a lot of time and effort developing that fact-based journalism, so we believe that our IP needs to be protected, and we believe that these companies should be paying for access to our journalism. So we have been talking to companies. We had a much publicized content licensing deal with OpenAI to allow for exactly this kind of information sharing. And it's for a lot of what you said. It's because if this technology is happening, right? It's out of the gate. This is something that we have to live with. How do we make sure that it is generating fact-based information? And how do we make sure that if it's using our content to do that, that our IP, that the work of our journalists is protected and compensated?
This doves off the very first question. It's been widely reported that the journalists with AP, the New York Times and CNN were cut loose because of their known ties with Hamas. What can you tell me about that from the AP side?
This, I assume, relates to the first question there. Yeah.
Yes.
The first thing I just want to say here is that nobody who works for the Associated Press has any known ties to Hamas or had any forewarning about that attack. There was one, this is public, there was one freelance journalist who we worked with on a small number of cases who we're no longer working with right now. We reevaluate our freelance arrangements all the time. We always prioritize the safety of our staff, the people who we are fully responsible for, and we make determinations on whether other relationships that we have with freelancers make sense in that environment. So we were very public that we stopped working with one person. But again, even having made that decision, I can tell you with certainty that nobody who we have worked with on staff or on a freelance basis had any forewarning of the October 7th attacks.
So they weren't let go because of that then? They just were let go?
There was nothing to let go of. They weren't working for us. We're no longer working with that freelancer.
Hey, Joy, thanks for being here, and thanks for all you do. With the primetime wars we have going on at the moment, Ukraine and, Middle East, and what's it like trying to shed a little light and surface facts in places like parts of Africa and South America that are so consequential? And North Korea, if you'll talk about North Korea in your coverage of North Korea for just a minute.
It's such a good question. So I was actually in Africa as the war in the Middle East was starting, visiting our bureaus in Johannesburg and in Nairobi, and it was, you're so right. You go to some of our bureaus that get less attention, when it comes to, some of the stories that they're doing and some of the work that they're doing, and the importance of the places where they're working. When you think about Africa and you think about the youth population in Africa and the stories that are going to generate from that continent, as a result of having this massive population of young people, it's really fascinating. It's really intriguing. Latin America, from a climate standpoint, from a democracy standpoint, is such, from a migration standpoint, is just such a wealth of stories there. my job is to make sure that we maintain our commitment to covering those places, even when these other priorities happen, even when public attention is focused on these other places. It's a real challenge, though, because the audience interest ping-pongs a lot to kind of the shiny new object. And so what we do, we spend a lot of time with our teams. This is what I was doing when I was in Johannesburg and in Nairobi, is talking to them about how can we tackle this coverage in a way that tries to break through. We actively talk about that. We actively say, we know that this coverage is not going to lead everybody's newscast or everybody's website. So what can we do to tackle it in a way that might? So we think a lot about the thematic stories that connect into those other themes that I mentioned, things like climate. We look for things that may feel counterintuitive. I think it's really important, particularly when it comes to stories out of Africa, that we talk about solutions, that we talk about stories about people, optimism, uplifting stories, that it doesn't always feel like it's negative, that it doesn't always feel like it's a place that's mired in conflict. So we talk about that piece of it a lot. We try to show these places with all of their nuance and all of their character. But yeah, it's a real challenge when you have these big global stories that come up. Next year, as I said, we're going to have 2 wars and a U.S. election. That doesn't leave a lot of bandwidth, for a lot else in terms of audience consumption, but our commitment to covering these locations is ongoing. North Korea is a really fascinating story for us. So the AP was the first international news organization to open a bureau in North Korea. We did that several years ago. It's an unusual bureau and an unusual and unique arrangement, I would say. We've not been able to send any international journalists into North Korea since the pandemic began. That country has been virtually completely walled off, save a couple of Chinese officials who have been able to go in recent months. When we were able to go in before and send international journalists in there, you're getting a highly sanitized version of events, but even that, for a country that is so walled off, even that is fascinating and revelatory. And that's what makes it, for us, worthwhile. We know, that this is not, we're not operating in a free and fair environment like we would expect to, but the things that we're seeing, the things that we're allowed to bring back to the rest of the world are truly revelatory. And I think when we hopefully are able to send people in again, it'll have that same impact.
So I'll remind everybody, don't go home with a question that you wish you asked. Julie, there were a question that came up with the students this afternoon that I think the audience may be interested in. This has been fascinating to learn about the overall matter of AP covering the world, but you answered a question about your years covering the White House, which were during the Obama years and part of the Trump and years, and some of the contrast, but could you do a little storytelling from that part of your life?
Sure, happy to. So as Mark mentioned, I covered the White House under Obama and under Trump, and there were no shortage of contrasts between the two. The first thing, Carolyn Castor, who's one of our AP photographers, covered the White House as well during those years with me. We've traveled a lot of miles together over the years. The first thing that I always, want to mention here is that from an access standpoint, and in some regards, from a transparency standpoint, covering Trump was far better than covering Obama. I remember what I told the students is, when I was covering Obama, I used to beg for the tiniest little detail of something that was happening in the room. I would say, was he drinking tea or was he drinking water? Was he seated on the couch or was he in a chair? And some official would say, oh, fine, all right, I'm gonna tell you on background, he was drinking tea and he was on the couch. And you'd be like, a win, amazing. And when you were covering Trump, you'd have sources who would literally be texting you details from the Oval Office as the meeting was happening. So from an information standpoint, it was just such a contrast. And look, as a journalist, I always want more information than less. The other thing that was really helpful as a journalist covering Trump was you knew exactly what was on his mind. You know, he told you what he was thinking. He tweeted what he was thinking. He talked to us as journalists all the time. As Carolyn knows, sometimes it was too much. We said enough. We had enough information that day. But it was a constant flow of information. With Obama, you know, if you got to ask him a question once a week, you know, you felt pretty good about yourself. So from an access standpoint, you know, it was a night and day scenario. Now, you know, from a fact standpoint, there were a lot of challenges. And I think that it became, you know, a real challenge to make sure that we were making clear when information was being tweeted or said, you know, what was fact and what was not. And I think, you know, I talked at the beginning, I mentioned, and I said this to students earlier today, that I think that where, you know, some of the media got off track a little bit during that time was losing the focus on the facts and making it more about kind of us versus them, becoming that sort of inserting ourselves in the mix, allowing ourselves to be inserted in the mix, allowing ourselves to be a player in the story, as opposed to saying, look, we're just here to tell you what the facts are, right? This is what you've heard, this is what the facts are. We're not fighting, we're not opposing, we're not on a side here other than to tell you what the facts are. And I happen to think there is a lot of power in doing that. I think there is a lot of power in taking that position. And I think that you lose some of your ability to help inform people and shape the facts when you become part of the story. And I think that became a real challenge. And I think, you know, in talking to a lot of my colleagues who did similar jobs during that time, I think, you know, there are mixed opinions on what I said there. As I said, you're not going to agree with everything I've said. Other people don't always agree with everything I said there. But for who we are as the AP, that's the right place to be. And that's where, you know, we'll find ourselves, you know, as we're delving into the next election, which starts in Iowa in 40-something days.
Julie, this may sound a little bit about like a commercial. I'm not paid to say this, but I want to tell you that AP has an app, and I use it on a daily basis. Just download it from your app store, and you can read the AP report. Interestingly, that's not always been true. As Julie said at the beginning, AP is a consortium of news organizations, subscribers, and you can imagine that if you're selling a newspaper in Cincinnati, that you may not want AP's material to be available for free. But the model has changed, and there's some amazing work, investigative work going on. If you haven't seen a story, for example, on sex abuse in the Mormon church, that's one recent example of it, with some in-depth reporting that you may not be able to read any other way. But and plus the photography. There's a weekly summary of photojournalism from around the world, and it's pretty amazing quality stuff. There's no accident that AP's photographers won the Pulitzer, I think, 2 years in a row. So, so having said that, what is your vision as a leader at AP on how AP report will be consumed in the years ahead?
It's a great question. And you know, as I said, our news organization has changed so much in 177 years, the way we produce the news, the way that people consume the news. And so if you know, I could sort of think about the future and what I want the AP to look like, you know, when I step away from this job, you know, I want us to be seen as, you know, continuing to hold on to that fact-based, nonpartisan journalism. And I wanted us to be producing a news report that meets people where they are. And that increasingly means being a digital-first news organization, thinking about stories from the standpoint of the consumer. You know, do you want to see that story in video and in photos? Do you want to read it? Do you want to hear it in audio? What's the best way to package that story for the needs of our audiences? And I think, to your point, you know, we don't see a conflict in our business model between being able to reach audiences directly through our own platforms. And I liked Mark's plug for the app. It's good. We actually have a new one coming out early in 2024. I don't see a conflict between trying to reach audiences there and then trying to also serve the needs of our customers and their audiences through their own platforms In fact, the lessons that we've learned by having our own digital site has allowed us to provide a report that is more digitally friendly, that is more textured. We can do that kind of experimentation, have that sandbox of our own that I think will allow us to stay really essential to our customers as they make this transition themselves.
We have a question in the audience.
So following up on the theme of misinformation, the need to center truth, how do you deal with a partisan political environment where there is the leader of a political party who is widely espousing known untruths? Following your climate change model, how do you avoid repeating the misinformation while still maintaining that balance when there's a big portion that doesn't believe the truth?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and I would say for us, we tried to make sure that we are always putting the facts at the front of the coverage, that we are repeating the facts. As I mentioned, when it comes to 2020 election denialism, we don't pull any punches in the way that we talk about what happened in 2020. We make sure that we are repeating over and over again what the facts are. As you said, there are a lot of people who don't believe us on that. We can package the facts in as many ways as we want to, and we try really hard. I mean, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we are going to reach people with facts. Not because I always want to be really clear. I'm not trying to change how anybody votes. I'm not trying to say, go here, go there, support this person. That's not my job, right? It's not my job. My job is to give you facts. And if you want to agree with them and act in that way, go ahead. If you want to disagree with them and act in that way, go ahead. My job is to just put facts in front of you. And so, we are spending a lot of time thinking about 2024 and thinking about how we're going to be, as I said, describing our race calls, how we're going to be talking about the facts. There is misinformation, in all stripes here, and we need to make sure that we're kind of treating that in the same way. But if a particular fact, and I think this is a little bit of what you're getting at, if a particular fact is becoming, so pervasive, we kind of can't, a particular piece of misinformation is becoming so pervasive, we can't ignore it. Like, I do feel like we need to tackle that head on. Uh-oh, I know you.
Hey. Hi, Julie.
Hi.
A couple questions for political analysis.
Uh-oh.
Looking ahead to Ohio's Senate race next year, how important do you think it's going to be nationally, and how much media attention do we expect to see? And then the other question is, since Andy Beshear just won a red state for a second time, where do you think he is as far as national significance now?
I'll take the last one first, then we can get to Ohio. I mean, Beshear is a really interesting candidate, and a really interesting, has run, really interesting campaigns here and governed in interesting ways. I think it's always tricky, though, to kind of overread those results in one state. I mean, he has run a very specific set of campaigns and governed in a very specific way for his state. Is that replicable in other ways outside of Kentucky? I'm not sure. And I think sometimes where, parties can go astray is when they say, we have to run the X model nationally. We have to do this, more broadly. Oftentimes you find that the most successful politicians in both parties are successful because they know the place where they're based, right? They know the people there. They know how to talk with them. They know, what they care about. They know what issues really resonate, and it's not always applicable, for a broader audience. I'm not saying he doesn't have potentially, broader, a broader runway there, but in my experience, it tends to be when we overread, or a party overreads, someone's success in a particular place and tries to nationalize it. Ohio Senate, look, there's always interest in Ohio. It's an interesting state, though, in the sense that it has certainly shifted, much further into Republican columns than, my first presidential campaign was 2008. Ohio was still kind of the ultimate swing state. But a Senate race in Ohio is always going to be of national importance and national attention. And I think with so many Senate races next year, that could shift the balance, because it's so tight in the Senate right now. Any one of these races, could shift the balance back into the Republican column. I have a feeling you're going to see several AP political reporters in your backyard in the next couple months.
Well, thank you, in-person audience and virtual audience, and please join me in thanking Julie for being with us and for her comments this evening.
Thank you all.
And please visit the NKU 6 at 6 website. You may have seen this already, but we will be back with our community lecture series next time, January the 19th in Augusta, and at the Echo Hall, which is the dormitory for the old Augusta College, which was a place where some of the most important abolitionists were educated, and Augusta has an outsized, I think, a role to play in the story of the Underground Railroad, and we will have some students from NKU in the dance department who are interpreting that story in dance to open it. So you can be with us in person. It's relatively small, so if you want to come to Augusta, register now, but you can also watch it through the live stream. And by the way, the team that students at the camera are with Norse Media. What we do in this series includes trying to find ways for students to have activities aligned with what they're studying, and so they are producing the webcast this evening as an educational experience. So let's say thanks to North Media. And good night, and thanks for being with us.